Welcome, dear friend. I know you watch this video to fall asleep, so before that, like, comment, and share this video. Also, where are you from, and what time is it where you are from? Tonight we embark on a journey that has been 25 centuries in the making. A collection of stories so sacred and transformative that they have quietly shaped the hearts of countless seekers across generations. These are not just tales for entertainment, but living teachings that carry within them the power to dissolve anxiety, quiet restless minds, and guide you toward the deepest rest your soul has ever known. What you're about to experience is something extraordinary. Over the next several hours, I will share with you 300 untold Buddhist stories, each one carefully selected and lovingly crafted to serve as a bridge between your busy, worried mind and the infinite calm that lies waiting within you. These stories have been gathered from remote monasteries hidden in misty mountains, from the whispered teachings of enlightened masters, and from the profound experiences of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary peace through the Buddha's timeless wisdom. But here's what makes this collection truly special. Unlike the familiar parables you may have heard before, these are the hidden gems, the secret teachings that have been passed down through generations of monks and meditation masters, stories that were shared only in the quiet hours before dawn, in candlelit halls where seekers gathered to hear truths that could transform their very understanding of existence. Tonight, these sacred narratives are being shared with you, creating a tapestry of wisdom that will gently carry you from wherever you are now into the deepest, most restorative sleep you've experienced in years. Each story has been chosen not just for its wisdom, but for its unique ability to quiet the mind's constant chatter and replace worry with wonder, anxiety with acceptance, and restlessness with profound rest. As we move through these tales together, you'll notice something remarkable happening. The weight of your day will begin to lift. The endless loop of thoughts that usually keeps you awake will start to slow and soften. Your breathing will naturally deepen. Your muscles will release their tension, and you'll find yourself sinking into a state of peaceful awareness that feels like coming home to yourself. The Buddha once said that the mind is everything, and what you think, you become. Tonight, through these carefully curated stories, we're going to fill your mind with images of peace, wisdom, and profound tranquility. We're going to plant seeds of calm that will continue to grow even as you sleep, creating new neural pathways that lead not to stress and worry, but to serenity and insight. Now, you might be wondering why stories are so powerful for sleep and meditation. The answer lies in how our consciousness works. When we're caught in the grip of anxiety or restlessness, our minds are typically fixated on our own problems, cycling through the same worries and concerns like a broken record. But when we immerse ourselves in a story, something magical happens. Our awareness shifts from the narrow focus of personal worry to the expansive landscape of narrative, where wisdom can enter through the back door of our consciousness, while we're enchanted by characters and situations that mirror our own deepest truths. These Buddhist stories work like gentle teachers, offering profound insights wrapped in simple, beautiful narratives that speak directly to the heart. They don't lecture or demand that you change your thinking. Instead, they invite you into experiences that naturally shift your perspective, showing you through metaphor and example how to find peace in the midst of chaos, how to discover strength in apparent weakness, and how to recognize the profound ordinary miracle of simply being alive and aware in this moment. What makes this collection even more remarkable is its scope and depth. We'll journey through stories of wise fools who stumble into enlightenment, of proud scholars who learn humility from the most unexpected teachers, of ordinary people who discover that their greatest challenges were actually their most precious gifts. We'll meet monks who find wisdom in failure, merchants who discover that true wealth cannot be counted in coins, and travelers who learn that the destination they sought was present in every step of their journey. Some stories will make you smile with gentle recognition as they illuminate patterns in your own life with loving humor. Others will move you to tears as they reveal the profound beauty that exists even in life's most difficult moments. Many will simply wrap around you like a warm embrace, creating a cocoon of peace that carries you effortlessly into the deepest rest. As we begin this journey together, I want you to know that there's absolutely nothing you need to do except listen and allow these stories to wash over you like gentle waves on a peaceful shore. You don't need to analyze or remember every detail. You don't need to figure out hidden meanings or apply specific teachings to your life. The wisdom in these stories works on levels far deeper than conscious understanding. Simply by opening your heart to receive them, you're creating space for profound transformation to occur naturally and effortlessly. The ancient masters who first shared these teachings understood something that modern science is only now discovering. The stories we tell ourselves and the stories we absorb from others literally rewire our brains. They create new possibilities for how we experience reality, new templates for how we respond to challenge and change, and new pathways toward peace and contentment that become more accessible each time we travel them. Tonight, as these 300 stories unfold, they're not just entertaining your mind, but actually restructuring your inner landscape, creating what the Buddhists call new karmic seeds. These are potentials for wisdom, compassion, and peace that will continue to grow and flourish long after tonight's journey is complete. You'll find yourself naturally responding to life's challenges with greater equanimity, discovering reserves of patience you didn't know you possessed, and accessing states of calm that feel both completely natural and mysteriously profound. The collection we're about to explore spans the entire range of human experience, from the lighthearted to the deeply moving, from the simple to the sublime. We'll visit bustling monasteries and remote hermitages, ancient kingdoms and timeless villages, encountering characters whose struggles and triumphs mirror our own deepest longings for meaning, connection, and peace. Some stories will transport you to mountain temples, where morning mist carries the sound of temple bells across valleys painted in autumn colors. Others will take you into the hearts of ordinary people who discover extraordinary wisdom in the midst of their daily routines. We'll witness moments of sudden awakening and gradual understanding, explosive insights and gentle revelations that unfold like flowers opening to the first light of dawn. What unites all these diverse tales is their common source in the Buddha's fundamental insight that suffering is optional, that peace is our birthright, and that the path to freedom lies not in changing our external circumstances, but in transforming our relationship to whatever life presents us. These stories don't promise that life will become easier, but they offer something far more valuable. They show us how to find unshakable peace in the midst of any storm, how to discover joy that doesn't depend on circumstances, and how to access a love so vast and unconditional that it includes even our own imperfections. As we prepare to dive into this ocean of wisdom, take a moment to settle into whatever position feels most comfortable for you. Let your body be completely supported, whether you're lying in bed, resting in a favorite chair, or finding comfort in any space that feels safe and nurturing. Feel free to close your eyes or let them rest gently on something peaceful. There's no right or wrong way to receive these gifts of ancient wisdom. Notice how your breath is already beginning to slow and deepen, as if your body knows that something nourishing is about to unfold. This is your nervous system's natural response to the promise of peace. The same response that has been activated in countless listeners over the centuries, as these timeless stories have been shared in quiet moments when the world grows still and the heart opens to receive truth. The journey we're about to take together isn't just a collection of stories. It's an initiation into a way of being that has sustained and comforted humanity's greatest spiritual seekers for over 2 millennia. Tonight, you become part of this ancient lineage of wisdom, joining the countless souls who have found solace, insight, and profound rest in these sacred narratives. So let us begin with the first of our 300 treasures, a story that comes to us from the mountains of ancient Tibet, where the air is so clear that stars seem close enough to pluck from the sky, and where a simple monastery cook discovered that enlightenment sometimes comes not through years of intense meditation, but through the patient, loving preparation of a single perfect bowl of rice. The story begins in the high peaks of Tibet, where monastery Tashi Lhunpo clung to the mountainside like a bird's nest built of stone and prayer flags. Here, among monks who spent their days in deep meditation and philosophical debate, lived a simple man named Pemba, whose only duty was to prepare the daily meals. While others pursued enlightenment through complex teachings and hours of sitting practice, Pemba found his entire world contained within the monastery kitchen, where enormous copper pots reflected the dancing flames of yak butter lamps. Pemba had arrived at the monastery not as a seeker of wisdom, but as a refugee from famine. His village in the valley below had been devastated by 3 years of failed harvests, and when his wife and children succumbed to hunger, he had nothing left but the clothes on his back and a heart so broken he could barely remember how to speak. The abbot, moved by compassion, had given him shelter and the simple task of feeding the community. For 7 years, Pemba performed his duties without complaint or aspiration. Each morning before dawn, while the monks gathered for their first meditation, he would light the kitchen fires and begin the careful process of preparing meals for over 200 residents. He washed rice grain by grain, ensuring no stone or chaff remained. He tended vegetables with the same attention a mother gives a sleeping child. His movements were economical, purposeful, free from the urgency that characterizes those who believe they have somewhere important to be. The other monks barely noticed him. To them, he was simply part of the monastery's infrastructure, as essential and invisible as the walls that sheltered them or the floors they walked upon. During their debates about the nature of emptiness and the path to liberation, Pemba remained in his kitchen, stirring soup with a wooden ladle worn smooth by years of use, his mind empty of philosophical concepts but full of quiet attention to the task at hand. But something remarkable was happening in that kitchen. Something that would eventually shake the foundations of everything the learned monks believed about the path to awakening. Day by day, meal by meal, Pemba was disappearing. Not physically, but the separate self that had once grieved so deeply for his lost family, that had once worried about tomorrow's bread, that had once defined itself through story and memory, was gradually dissolving into the simple act of service. When he chopped vegetables, there was only chopping. When he stirred the pot, there was only stirring. When he served the meals, there was only the ladling of soup into bowls, the quiet satisfaction of seeing empty plates return to his kitchen, the gentle cycle of nourishment flowing through the community. he had stumbled quite by accident into what the great masters spend lifetimes trying to achieve. Perfect presence, complete absorption, the dissolution of the one who does into the doing itself. One winter morning, as snow fell thick and silent outside the kitchen windows, something extraordinary occurred. Pemba was preparing the morning rice, a task he had performed thousands of times before. But as he poured the grains into the boiling water, watching them dance and settle, he suddenly saw something that made him stop completely. In that moment, the boundary between himself and the rice disappeared entirely. He saw, with a clarity that bypassed all intellectual understanding, that he and the rice and the water and the fire were not separate things, but different expressions of the same fundamental aliveness. The wooden spoon fell from his hand as tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. But these weren't tears of sadness or even joy. They were tears of recognition, the kind that flows when we suddenly remember something we had always known, but somehow forgotten. He saw that his wife and children had never actually died, that they lived on in every grain of rice he prepared, in every meal that nourished the community, in every act of love that rippled out from this simple kitchen into the world. Standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of his daily routine, Pemba realized that he had been living in enlightenment for years without knowing it. Not the dramatic awakening described in the sutras, with visions and supernatural powers, but the quiet, ordinary awakening that blooms naturally when we stop trying to be someone special and simply show up completely for whatever life asks of us. When the breakfast bell rang and the monks began filing into the dining hall, they found their morning meal waiting as always. But something was different. The rice seemed to glow with an inner light. The simple vegetable soup carried flavors that spoke directly to the heart. Even the humble barley tea tasted like nectar from the gods themselves. The monks ate in unusual silence, each spoonful somehow nourishing not just their bodies, but their souls. After the meal, the head monk approached the kitchen to thank Pemba for what had clearly been an extraordinary culinary achievement. But when he entered the kitchen, he found the cook sitting quietly by the window, watching the snow fall with eyes so clear and peaceful that they seemed to reflect the very sky itself. Without any words being spoken, the head monk immediately understood what had occurred. He dropped to his knees and pressed his palms together in reverence, recognizing that he was in the presence of someone who had achieved what all their years of study and meditation had been pointing toward. Word of the kitchen awakening spread quickly through the monastery, and soon monks were lining up not just for meals, but for teachings from the simple cook who had found enlightenment in a pot of rice. But Pemba had no teachings to offer, no philosophy to expound, no methods to share. When asked about his realization, he would simply smile and return to his work, chopping vegetables with the same quiet attention he had always brought to the task. This puzzled the scholarly monks, who were accustomed to complex explanations and detailed instructions for spiritual practice. How could someone achieve the ultimate goal without years of meditation, without mastering the philosophical texts, without even trying to become enlightened? Some began to suspect that Pemba's awakening was somehow incomplete or inferior to the classical path they had been following. One particularly learned monk, famous for his ability to recite entire sutras from memory and debate the finest points of Buddhist doctrine, decided to test the authenticity of the cook's realization. He approached Pemba during the preparation of the evening meal and posed a series of sophisticated questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between form and emptiness, and the various stages of the Bodhisattva path. Pemba listened patiently while continuing to stir a large pot of lentil stew. When the learned monk finished his interrogation, Pemba simply handed him a bowl of the stew and said, "Please taste this and tell me if it needs more salt." The monk, frustrated by what he perceived as an evasion of his profound questions, tasted the stew and grudgingly admitted it was perfectly seasoned. "Then you understand everything you need to understand," Pemba replied, returning his attention to the pot. This exchange, witnessed by several other monks, became legendary within the monastery. The scholar had approached with his head full of concepts and theories about enlightenment, while Pemba had responded from the enlightenment itself. The stew, perfectly balanced and nourishing, was his teaching. The invitation to taste rather than think was his method. The quiet satisfaction that comes from work well done was his philosophy. As months passed, more and more monks began spending time in the kitchen, not to question Pemba about his realization, but simply to be in his presence and observe how enlightenment expresses itself through the most ordinary activities. They watched him wash dishes with the same meditative absorption they brought to their formal sitting practice. They observed how he treated each grain of rice with the reverence others reserved for sacred relics. They saw how his very presence seemed to bless whatever he touched, transforming simple ingredients into meals that nourished both body and spirit. Gradually, the entire atmosphere of the monastery began to change. The rigid hierarchy that had previously separated learned scholars from simple workers started to dissolve. Monks who had spent years debating abstract philosophical points began to find equal wisdom in the practical teachings offered by sweeping floors, tending gardens, and preparing food with complete attention and love. The story of Pemba's kitchen enlightenment spread beyond the monastery walls, carried by visiting teachers and traveling pilgrims to other communities throughout Tibet and beyond. It became a source of hope for countless ordinary people who had believed that spiritual awakening was reserved for those with special talents or extensive education. Here was proof that the deepest truths could be discovered not in remote caves or sophisticated temples, but in the very midst of daily life, in the patient performance of simple tasks done with complete presence and love. Years later, when Pemba's hair had turned white and his hands had become gnarled from decades of service, a young seeker arrived at the monastery specifically hoping to study with the famous enlightened cook. The young man had traveled for months across treacherous mountain passes, driven by stories he had heard about the kitchen master who had achieved liberation through the preparation of simple meals. When he finally met Pemba, now quite elderly but still rising before dawn to tend the kitchen fires, the seeker asked the question that had burned in his heart throughout his long journey. "Master, please teach me the secret of finding enlightenment through cooking. Show me the special techniques, the sacred recipes, the mystical practices that led to your awakening." Pemba smiled gently and handed the young man an apron. "There are no secrets," he said quietly. "There are only potatoes that need peeling. If you can peel one potato with complete attention, you will understand everything. If you cannot peel one potato with complete attention, no amount of teaching will help you." The young seeker, expecting something more exotic and dramatic, felt initially disappointed. But as he took the apron and picked up his first potato, beginning the simple task of removing its skin with careful, mindful movements, he began to sense the profound wisdom hidden within the ordinary. This, then, was Pemba's teaching, not a method to be learned, but a way of being to be embodied, not a philosophy to be understood, but a love to be lived. In his quiet kitchen, surrounded by the steam and warmth of countless meals prepared with selfless attention, he had discovered what the Buddha himself had pointed toward 25 centuries earlier. The path to freedom lies not in transcending our ordinary human experience, but in bringing such complete presence and compassion to that experience that the boundary between self and service, between seeker and sought, between the sacred and the mundane, simply dissolves into the seamless flow of awakened living. And so our first story comes to its natural close, like the gentle settling of steam that rises from Pemba's kitchen pots, carrying with it the essence of profound simplicity. As you feel these words washing over you, notice how your own breathing has perhaps begun to mirror the rhythm of Pemba's quiet work, steady and unhurried, present and complete. Let us now journey from the snowy peaks of Tibet to the bamboo forests of ancient China, where our second tale unfolds in a monastery known for its unusual approach to spiritual training. This is the story of Master Wei and the student who could not sit still, a teaching about the profound wisdom that can emerge when we stop fighting our own nature and begin to dance with it instead. The Bamboo Grove Monastery sat nestled in a valley where morning mist clung to the hillsides like silk scarves draped across sleeping giants. Unlike other monasteries that emphasized strict meditation schedules and rigid discipline, this community was known throughout the land for its unconventional methods. Here, students were encouraged to find their own unique pathway to awakening, guided by a master whose wisdom seemed to flow as naturally as water, finding its course down the mountainside. Among the newest arrivals was a young man named Chen, whose restless energy was apparent from the moment he entered the monastery gates. While other students could sit motionless in meditation for hours, Chen fidgeted constantly. His legs would cramp, his back would ache, and his mind would race with such intensity that he often had to excuse himself from the meditation hall, feeling like a failure before his practice had even begun. Night after night, Chen would lie on his simple sleeping mat, tormented by the sounds of deep, peaceful breathing from his fellow students, while his own mind churned with self-criticism and doubt. He had come to the monastery with such sincere intention, such genuine longing for the peace he saw reflected in the faces of accomplished meditators. Yet here he was, seemingly incapable of the most basic requirements of spiritual practice. The other students, while kind, could not hide their puzzlement at Chen's obvious struggles. During walking meditation, when they moved in slow, mindful steps around the monastery grounds, Chen would inevitably speed up, his natural pace far quicker than the contemplative rhythm the practice demanded. During meals eaten in silence, Chen's chopsticks would click against his bowl with an urgency that seemed to violate the sacred atmosphere of mindful eating. Master Wei observed all of this with the patient attention of someone who had spent decades watching the infinite varieties of human suffering and awakening. He noticed how Chen's energy seemed to vibrate at a frequency different from the other students, like a hummingbird among doves. Where others saw restlessness and inability, the master saw something else entirely. He saw potential waiting for the right conditions to flower. One morning, as Chen sat struggling through yet another meditation session, his legs bouncing involuntarily beneath his robes, Master Wei approached quietly and whispered a single instruction that would change everything. "Meet me in the bamboo grove at sunset." And Chen, the young student, looked up with eyes full of frustrated hope. "Bring your fidgeting. Bring your restlessness. Bring everything you think is wrong with you." That evening, As golden light filtered through the towering bamboo stalks that gave the monastery its name, Chen found Master Wei standing in a small clearing, perfectly still except for the gentle swaying that matched the rhythm of the bamboo around him. The master's eyes were closed, but he seemed completely aware of his surroundings, as if he had become part of the grove itself. "Chen," Master Wei said without opening his eyes, "show me your restlessness." The young student stood confused, unsure what was being asked of him. "I don't understand, Master. I'm trying to overcome my restlessness, not display it." The master smiled, his eyes still closed. "And how is that working for you?" The question hung in the air like a cone waiting to be unlocked. Chen realized with sudden clarity that his months of fighting against his own nature had brought him nothing but misery. He had been trying to force himself into a mold that simply didn't fit, like attempting to make the bamboo grow in straight lines when its nature was to sway and bend with every breeze. "I want you to move," Master Wei continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Move however your body wants to move. Don't think about it. Don't judge it. Don't try to make it look like meditation is supposed to look. Just let your energy express itself naturally and see what happens." For a long moment, Chen stood frozen by decades of conditioning that had taught him to suppress his natural impulses in favor of approved behavior. But something in the master's presence, combined with the gentle rustling of bamboo leaves overhead, created a space of permission he had never experienced before. Slowly, tentatively, he began to sway. At first, his movements were self-conscious and restricted, still filtered through his ideas about what was appropriate or spiritual. But as the master continued to stand in perfect, accepting stillness, Chen gradually began to let go. His swaying became more fluid, his steps more spontaneous. Soon he was moving through the bamboo grove with a grace and freedom he had never known he possessed. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, each moment crystalline and complete. As Chen moved with increasing abandon, following impulses that arose from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, he began to notice something extraordinary. His mind, which had been chattering constantly during months of forced stillness, suddenly became quiet. Not the forced quiet of suppression, but the natural silence that emerges when energy finds its proper channel. He found himself dancing with the bamboo, his movements synchronized with the swaying stalks around him. His breathing deepened without effort. His awareness expanded to include not just his own body, but the entire grove. The sunset painting everything in amber light. The master standing like a patient mountain in the center of it all. For the first time since arriving at the monastery, Chen felt truly at peace. When he finally came to rest, settling naturally into stillness as his energy found its completion, he discovered something that would transform his understanding of spiritual practice forever. The stillness he now experienced was not empty or forced, but full and alive, pregnant with the same vitality that had just expressed itself through movement. He had not overcome his restless nature. Instead, he had learned to dance with it, and in that dancing, he had found the very peace he had been seeking through its suppression. Master Wei opened his eyes and smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher who has just witnessed a student discover their own unique doorway into truth. "Tell me, Chen, how does your meditation feel now?" Chen settled into a sitting position and immediately noticed the difference. His body felt grounded and stable, his mind clear and present. The fidgeting that had plagued him for months was nowhere to be found, not because he had conquered it, but because its energy had been honored and expressed. "Master, Chen whispered, his voice filled with wonder. I think I've been trying to become someone else's version of peaceful instead of discovering my own. Master Wei nodded slowly. The bamboo does not try to be an oak tree. The river does not try to be a mountain. Each finds its own way to express the same underlying stillness. Your restlessness was never your enemy, Chen. It was your teacher, waiting for you to listen to its message. From that evening forward, Chen's practice transformed completely. He began each day with movement meditation in the bamboo grove, allowing his body's natural energy to flow and express itself freely before settling into sitting practice. His meditation sessions became deep and stable, rooted in the wisdom of his own embodied experience rather than imposed from external ideas about how practice should look. Word of Chen's breakthrough spread throughout the monastery, not as gossip, but as inspiration. Other students who had been struggling with their own forms of self-rejection began to wonder if they too might find liberation through acceptance rather than resistance. Master Wei, recognizing a teaching moment that could benefit the entire community, began incorporating movement practices into the monastery's daily routine. Soon, the bamboo grove became known throughout the region not just as a place of traditional sitting meditation, but as a sanctuary where seekers could discover that there are as many paths to awakening as there are individuals walking them. Students came from distant provinces to learn what they called bamboo meditation, though Master Wei always insisted there was nothing special about the technique itself. We are not teaching a method, he would explain to visiting teachers who came to observe these unconventional practices. We are creating conditions where students can discover their own innate wisdom. Some find peace through stillness, others through movement, still others through service or study or contemplation. The bamboo does not judge the oak for its different way of reaching toward the sun. Years passed, and Chen matured into one of the monastery's most gifted teachers, though his classes looked unlike any traditional Buddhist instruction. Students might find themselves dancing with scarves in the morning, sitting in deep meditation at noon, or engaging in spirited philosophical discussions while walking the mountain paths at sunset. Each activity flowed naturally into the next, guided by the organic rhythms of energy and attention rather than rigid schedules imposed from above. One day, a delegation of traditional monks arrived from a prestigious monastery in the capital, having heard disturbing reports about the unorthodox practices being taught in the bamboo grove. They came with the intention of correcting what they saw as a dangerous departure from proper Buddhist discipline. The head of the delegation, a stern master renowned for his strict adherence to traditional forms, requested a formal meeting with Master Wei to discuss these concerning innovations. Master Wei received the visiting monks with perfect courtesy, offering them tea and comfortable cushions in the monastery's main hall. When the stern master began his critique of the movement practices and flexible scheduling, Master Wei listened with the same patient attention he brought to everything. When the visitor finished his lengthy discourse on the importance of traditional forms and proper discipline, Master Wei made a simple request. "Honored brother," he said with genuine respect, "would you be willing to observe our evening practice before we continue this discussion? I think you might find it illuminating." The traditional master agreed, though his expression suggested he expected to witness confirmation of his worst fears about these unorthodox methods. As the sun began to set, the entire community gathered in the bamboo grove. What the visiting monks witnessed challenged every assumption they had brought with them about spiritual practice. They saw students moving with a grace and presence that spoke of deep inner cultivation. They observed periods of sitting meditation that were marked by profound stillness and concentration. They watched as movement naturally evolved into stillness, and stillness organically gave rise to movement, all flowing with the natural rhythm of awakened awareness. But most striking of all was the quality of presence they sensed in every student. These practitioners radiated a joy and authenticity that was unmistakable. Their eyes held the clarity that comes from genuine spiritual development. Their interactions with each other were marked by a compassion and understanding that could only arise from deep self-acceptance and inner peace. The stern master found himself deeply moved despite his initial resistance. As he watched Chen leading a group of students in what appeared to be a spontaneous dance of gratitude to the setting sun, he recognized something that his years of traditional training had somehow missed. These students had not abandoned discipline. They had discovered a discipline that honored their complete humanity, rather than demanding the suppression of inconvenient aspects of their nature. When the practice concluded and the community settled into the profound silence that follows authentic expression, the visiting master approached Master Wei with tears in his eyes. "I came here to correct what I thought was a mistake," he said quietly. "Instead, I find myself wondering if the mistake has been mine. How do you maintain such depth of practice while allowing such freedom of expression?" Master Wei's response became legendary, repeated in Buddhist communities throughout China for generations to come. When you trust the Buddha nature that lives within each student, when you create conditions of safety and acceptance where that nature can reveal itself authentically, discipline arises naturally from within rather than being imposed from without. The bamboo needs no instruction on how to grow toward the light. It simply needs soil, water, and space to express its inherent wisdom. The visiting delegation stayed for several weeks, participating in the community's practices and observing the profound transformations that occurred when students were encouraged to find their own authentic relationship with the Dharma. Several of the monks requested permission to remain permanently, while others returned to their own monasteries carrying seeds of this more flexible and compassionate approach to spiritual training. Chen, now recognized as a master teacher in his own right, often reflected on the profound gift he had received that first evening in the bamboo grove. By learning to embrace rather than reject his restless nature, he had discovered not only his own path to peace, but a way of helping others find theirs as well. His teaching became renowned for its ability to meet students exactly where they were, offering not a one-size-fits-all approach to awakening, but a spacious invitation to discover the unique expression of wisdom that lived within each individual heart. As our second story draws to its close, like the natural settling that comes at the end of a beautiful dance, we carry with us Chen's precious discovery that the very qualities we judge as obstacles to our spiritual development may actually be the keys to our unique doorway into freedom. Sometimes the path to stillness leads not around our restless energy, but directly through its authentic expression, transforming resistance into acceptance, struggle into flow, and self-rejection into the profound self-love that is the foundation of all genuine spiritual growth. Let us now venture deeper into this treasury of ancient wisdom with our third tale, a story that emerges from the mist-shrouded temples of ancient Japan, where the art of tea ceremony was considered as sacred as any formal meditation. This is the story of the broken cup and the master who discovered that perfection lies not in flawlessness, but in the exquisite beauty of embracing our cracks. In the ancient city of Kyoto, where cherry blossoms fell like snow each spring and temple bells marked the passing of peaceful days, there stood a tea house renowned throughout Japan for its master's extraordinary skill. Sato-san had devoted 40 years of his life to perfecting the way of tea, and his ceremonies were spoken of in reverent whispers by all who had been fortunate enough to witness them. His movements were poetry in motion, each gesture flowing seamlessly into the next with a precision that seemed to stop time itself. Every element of Sato-san's tea house reflected his pursuit of absolute perfection. The bamboo water ladles were carved to mathematical exactness. The ceramic bowls were selected for their flawless glazes and perfect symmetry. Even the tatami mats were positioned with an accuracy that would satisfy the most demanding architect. Visitors would often comment that entering his tea house felt like stepping into a pure realm where the chaos and imperfection of ordinary life could not intrude. But this pursuit of perfection, while creating breathtaking beauty, had also created something else entirely. Sato-san had become a prisoner of his own impossibly high standards. He would spend hours adjusting the angle of a single flower in its vase, discarding bowl after bowl, until he found one whose proportions met his exacting requirements. Students who came seeking to learn the way of tea often left feeling more anxious than peaceful, overwhelmed by the pressure to perform each movement with an accuracy that seemed humanly impossible. The master himself, though revered by all who knew him, lived in a state of constant tension. Each ceremony was an ordeal of vigilance, where the smallest deviation from perfect form would send ripples of distress through his carefully controlled composure. He had achieved technical mastery beyond question, but somewhere along the way, the joy and spontaneity that had originally drawn him to the tea ceremony had been sacrificed on the altar of his relentless perfectionism. One autumn morning, as maple leaves painted the garden in shades of gold and crimson, Sato-san was preparing for a ceremony that would host the governor of the province, a man known for his refined taste and sharp eye for detail. The master had spent weeks selecting each element of the ceremony, practicing every movement until it flowed with mechanical precision. This would be the culmination of his life's work, a demonstration of tea mastery that would secure his reputation for generations to come. As the appointed hour approached, Sato-san performed his final preparations with the focused intensity of a samurai preparing for battle. He arranged the tea implements with surgical precision, checked the water temperature for the 100th time, and adjusted his posture until it achieved the classical elegance described in the ancient texts. Everything was perfect, exactly as it should be according to 4 decades of disciplined study. The ceremony began flawlessly. The governor and his retinue watched in silent admiration as Sato-san moved through the familiar ritual with breathtaking grace. Each scoop of tea powder was measured to the exact gram. Each whisking motion created foam of precisely the right consistency. The presentation of the bowl followed protocols that had been refined over centuries of tradition. For 30 minutes, perfection reigned supreme in that small tea house. And then, in a moment that would forever change not only Sato-san's understanding of his art, but his entire approach to life, the unthinkable happened. As he lifted the completed bowl of tea to present it to the honored guest, a tremor passed through his hands. Perhaps it was the weight of expectation, perhaps the natural shakiness that comes with advancing age, or perhaps it was simply the universe's way of delivering a teaching that 40 years of perfect technique had been unable to provide. The priceless tea bowl, a ceramic masterpiece that had been in his family for 6 generations, slipped from his fingers and shattered against the wooden floor. In the silence that followed, as fragments of irreplaceable pottery scattered across the pristine tatami mats, Sato-san felt his entire world collapse. 40 years of reputation, destroyed in an instant. A ceremony that was to be the crown jewel of his career, ruined by a moment of human fallibility. But as the master knelt among the broken pieces, something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of the shame and devastation he expected to feel, a profound sense of relief washed over him. The pressure that had been building for decades suddenly released, like a dam bursting to allow a river to flow freely once again. In that moment of complete failure, he discovered something that all his years of perfect technique had hidden from him. He began to laugh, not the bitter laughter of hysteria, but the deep, joyful laughter of recognition. As he gathered the broken fragments in his hands, he saw each crack and chip not as flaws to be hidden or repaired, but as unique expressions of the bowl's journey through time and space. These breaks told the story of the clay's transformation in the kiln's fire, of the potter's hands that had shaped it, of the countless ceremonies it had witnessed, and finally, of this moment when it had chosen to release itself from the burden of perfection. The governor and his companions watched in amazement as Sato-san carefully arranged the broken pieces on a silk cloth, handling each fragment with the same reverence he had once reserved for intact treasures. "Honored guest," the master said, his voice filled with a lightness that had been absent for years, "I offer you something far more precious than perfect tea. I offer you the truth that lies beneath all our careful pretending." What followed was unlike any tea ceremony that had ever been performed in that house. Using a simple, everyday bowl that he normally reserved for his personal practice, Sato-san prepared tea with a spontaneity and joy that transformed the entire atmosphere. His movements, no longer constrained by the fear of making mistakes, flowed with a natural grace that was far more beautiful than any technical perfection could ever be. As he served the tea, he spoke about the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with veins of gold, making the cracks themselves part of the vessel's beauty. "We spend our lives trying to avoid breaking," he reflected, offering the simple bowl with hands that no longer trembled with the pressure of perfection. "But perhaps our breaks are where the light gets in. Perhaps our flaws are not obstacles to beauty, but invitations to discover a deeper kind of wholeness." The governor, a man accustomed to the finest things in life, later said that this broken ceremony was the most moving spiritual experience he had ever encountered. The tea itself tasted different somehow, infused with an authenticity that could never be achieved through technique alone. In witnessing Sato-san's transformation from perfectionist to authentic human being, everyone present had received a teaching about the profound beauty that emerges when we stop hiding our humanity and instead learn to embrace it completely. Word of the broken bowls ceremony spread throughout Japan, not as a story of failure, but as a tale of liberation. Students who had once been intimidated by Sato-san's impossible standards now flocked to study with him, drawn by the warmth and acceptance that had replaced his former rigidity. His teaching style transformed completely, emphasizing presence and authenticity over technical precision. In the months that followed, Sato-san began incorporating the philosophy of wabi-sabi into his tea ceremonies, celebrating the beauty found in imperfection and impermanence. He would often begin classes by intentionally using chipped bowls or slightly asymmetrical implements, teaching students to find elegance in the irregular and grace in the imperfect. His tea house became known not for its flawless presentations, but for the profound sense of peace and acceptance that permeated every gathering. One of his most dedicated students, a young woman named Keiko, who had initially been paralyzed by her fear of making mistakes, experienced her own breakthrough during a ceremony where she accidentally spilled tea on her kimono. Instead of the criticism she expected, she found Sato-san smiling with genuine delight. "Ah," he said, "now your kimono tells a story. Before it was just beautiful fabric. Now it carries the memory of this moment, this tea, this shared humanity." The master began teaching what he called the way of broken beauty, showing students how to find perfection not in the absence of flaws, but in the complete acceptance of whatever arose. Ceremonies became celebrations of the unpredictable, where spilled tea became part of the art, where trembling hands were welcomed as expressions of authentic presence, where the goal was not to eliminate mistakes, but to meet them with such grace that they transformed into teachings. Years passed, and Sato-san's reputation evolved from that of a technical master to something far more precious, a guide who could show others how to find beauty in their own brokenness. Visitors came not to witness flawless performance, but to experience the profound peace that comes from being accepted exactly as they are, cracks and all. The broken bowl, carefully preserved in a place of honor, became a reminder that some of life's greatest gifts arrive disguised as disasters. On quiet evenings, when the last student had departed and the tea house settled into stillness, Sato-san would often sit with the fragments of that precious bowl, running his fingers along the edges where gold lacquer now highlighted every break. In learning to love his shattered ceramic, he had discovered how to love his own imperfect humanity. In accepting the bowl's brokenness as part of its unique beauty, he had found the key to accepting himself and others with the same unconditional compassion. The teaching that emerged from that single moment of dropping a bowl became a cornerstone of his later philosophy. We are all broken vessels, cracked by life's inevitable challenges and disappointments. But these cracks need not be sources of shame or weakness. Instead, they can become the very places where light enters our lives, where gold threads of wisdom and compassion weave themselves into the fabric of our being, making us not less than we were before, but infinitely more beautiful in our authentic wholeness. As our third story settles into the peaceful silence that follows profound recognition, we carry with us Sato-san's precious discovery that perfection is not the absence of flaws, but the presence of love that can embrace every crack, every break, every imperfection as an essential part of our unique and irreplaceable beauty. Now let us journey to the bustling markets of ancient India, where merchants and mystics mingled in the dusty streets, and where our fourth tale unfolds. This is the story of the merchant who lost everything and found what he had been seeking his entire life, a teaching about the profound difference between having and being, between accumulating treasures and recognizing the treasure that we already are. In the great trading city of Varanasi, where the sacred Ganges River wound its way past temples and marketplaces that had witnessed centuries of human dreams and struggles, there lived a merchant named Dhanraj, whose success was legendary throughout northern India. His warehouses overflowed with silks from China, spices from the southern kingdoms, and precious stones from the mountains of Burma. Caravans bearing his mark traveled the length and breadth of the subcontinent, and his name was spoken with respect in trading posts from Delhi to Ceylon. But Dhanraj's wealth was more than mere accumulation. He had built his fortune through genuine service to others, providing quality goods at fair prices, and treating his employees with the respect and generosity that had earned him their fierce loyalty. Unlike many wealthy merchants who lived in fear of losing their possessions, Dhanraj seemed to understand that his riches were meant to flow like water, nourishing everyone they touched, before moving on to serve others. His home was a place of constant hospitality, where travelers could find shelter, where the hungry could find food, and where anyone in need could find assistance without question or judgment. His wife Prema shared his generous spirit, and together they had created not just a business empire, but a living demonstration of how material success could serve spiritual values. Their 3 children grew up understanding that wealth was a responsibility rather than a privilege, a tool for serving others rather than a means of elevating themselves above their fellow human beings. Yet despite all his outward success and genuine goodness, Dhanraj carried within him a restlessness that no amount of achievement seemed able to satisfy. In quiet moments, when the demands of business did not occupy his attention, he would find himself wondering if there might be something more to life than even the most ethical and successful material existence. He had heard stories of holy men who had renounced all worldly possessions and found a peace that no external circumstances could disturb. And he wondered if such contentment might be available to someone like himself. This spiritual longing led him to seek out teachers and sages whenever his travels brought him near ashrams or places of pilgrimage. He would sit respectfully at the feet of renowned masters, listening to their teachings about detachment and the illusory nature of material existence. Some teachers praised his generosity while encouraging him to consider complete renunciation. Others suggested that his wealth itself might be an obstacle to genuine spiritual development, a barrier that prevented him from discovering his true nature. These conversations both inspired and troubled Dhanraj. He genuinely wanted to understand the deepest truths of existence, but he also felt a responsibility to his family, his employees, and the many people who depended on his business for their livelihoods. How could he simply abandon everything to pursue enlightenment when so many others relied on his continued success? Yet how could he ignore the persistent feeling that his current life, fulfilling as it appeared to others, somehow missed the mark of what human existence might truly offer? One particular teacher, a severe ascetic who lived in a cave outside the city, challenged Dhanraj directly. "Your attachment to wealth is the chain that binds you to suffering," the holy man declared. "Until you release your grip on material possessions, you cannot hope to grasp the infinite. A camel loaded with goods cannot pass through the eye of a needle, and a heart loaded with worldly concerns cannot enter the kingdom of truth." This teaching haunted Dhanraj for months. He began to view his successful business with increasing ambivalence, seeing his wealth simultaneously as a blessing that allowed him to serve others, and as a curse that might be preventing him from discovering his deepest purpose. The internal conflict grew stronger each day, creating a tension between his worldly responsibilities and his spiritual aspirations that seemed impossible to resolve. The resolution came in a way that no one could have predicted. A series of catastrophic events struck Dhanraj's business empire in rapid succession, each disaster more devastating than the last. A monsoon of unprecedented severity destroyed several warehouses full of goods. Pirates attacked 3 of his most valuable caravans, making off with merchandise worth several fortunes. A fire consumed his main trading post in Delhi, and rumors began spreading that his business was cursed, causing customers and suppliers to seek other partners. Within the span of 6 months, everything Dhanraj had spent a lifetime building had vanished. His warehouses stood empty, his caravans no longer traveled the ancient trade routes, and his once vast wealth had evaporated like morning dew touched by the sun. Creditors demanded payment for loans that could no longer be repaid. Employees sought work elsewhere as the business collapsed around them. The magnificent house that had sheltered so many guests fell into disrepair, as there was no money for maintenance. Most devastating of all was watching his family struggle with the dramatic change in their circumstances. Prema, who had never complained about anything during their prosperous years, now faced the daily challenge of providing meals for their children with resources that dwindled each week. The children, who had grown up in comfort and security, now experienced the uncertainty and fear that comes with genuine poverty. Dhanraj felt as though he had failed in his most fundamental duty as a husband and father. The community that had once celebrated his success now whispered about his downfall with a mixture of pity and relief that often accompanies the witnessing of another's misfortune. Some former friends and business associates crossed the street to avoid encountering him, uncomfortable with the reminder of how quickly prosperity can disappear. Others offered condolences that felt more like attendance at a funeral than expressions of genuine support. But in the depths of this apparent catastrophe, something unexpected began to emerge. As the last of his possessions were sold to pay debts, as his family moved from their spacious home to a simple dwelling in the poorest quarter of the city, Dhanraj discovered that the spiritual peace he had been seeking through teachings and practices was beginning to arise naturally from the ashes of his former life. Without the constant demands of managing a vast business empire, he found himself with time for quiet reflection that had been impossible during his years of success. Without the weight of great wealth, he experienced a lightness of being that no amount of accumulation had ever provided. Without the complex web of relationships that had surrounded his business dealings, he discovered a simplicity in human connection that revealed how much of his previous social life had been built on mutual advantage rather than genuine affection. Most surprisingly of all, as his family adjusted to their reduced circumstances, their relationships with each other deepened in ways that prosperity had somehow prevented. Prema revealed strengths and wisdom that had been hidden behind the comfortable assumption that her husband would handle all of life's challenges. The children developed resourcefulness and compassion as they learned to find joy in simple pleasures and to help their neighbors who faced similar struggles. One evening, as Dhanraj sat outside their humble dwelling watching the sunset paint the sky in colors more beautiful than any silk he had ever traded, he experienced a moment of recognition that would reshape his understanding of everything he had thought he knew about success and failure, wealth and poverty, having and being. The peace that filled his heart in that moment was not the result of any spiritual practice or philosophical insight, but simply the natural state that emerged when the constant effort to maintain and protect external possessions finally ceased. He realized that during all his years of seeking spiritual teachings while maintaining his business empire, he had been like a man trying to see the stars while standing under brilliant floodlights. The wealth itself had not been the problem, but rather his unconscious identification with it, his subtle belief that his worth as a human being was somehow connected to his success as a merchant. Only when that identity was stripped away could he discover the being who existed prior to all accumulation, all achievement, all external validation. The laughter that bubbled up from deep within his chest carried with it the recognition of a cosmic joke that had been playing out in his life for decades. He had been searching for something that was never absent, seeking a treasure that he had never lost, pursuing a peace that was his birthright rather than his achievement. The holy men who had advised him to renounce his wealth had been pointing towards something true, but their method had been backwards. He had not needed to give up his possessions to find freedom. Instead, losing them had revealed that freedom had been there all along, hidden beneath his identification with having them. This recognition transformed everything. including his relationship to the poverty that now surrounded his family. Instead of seeing their reduced circumstances as a tragedy to be endured or overcome, Don Raj began to experience them as a gift that had revealed truths no amount of prosperity could have taught. He started sharing this perspective with Prema and the children, not as a way of making their hardships seem less real, but as an invitation to discover the richness that exists independent of external conditions. Their simple evening meals became celebrations of gratitude for whatever food was available. Their modest dwelling became a sanctuary where authentic presence replaced the need for impressive surroundings. Their reduced social status became an opportunity to form friendships based on genuine connection rather than mutual benefit. What had appeared to be loss revealed itself as a different kind of abundance, by pirates or destroyed by fire, where one that could not be stolen of Don Raj's transformation began to spread through the community, not as gausality of wealth, but by the deeper nourishment that ip about a fallen merchant, but as recognition their humble home, drawn not by the hospit, that something precious was emerging from apparent ruin. People began visiting, now came seeking something more valuable than merchandise had abandoned his business during its collapse. The peace and wisdom that radiated from someone flows from authentic presence. Former customers who had discovered contentment independent of circumstances to his modest house, his ascetic who had once criticized Don Raj's attachment to wealth, appeared at his door, having man crushed by the loss. One day, the severe of his worldly attachments, or perhaps heard rumors of the merchant's dramatic change of fortune and hands dirty from working in the soil, the attitude. The holy man came someone ready to join him in the expecting to find either a broken found Don Raj tending a renunciation. Instead, he small vegetable garden behin cave outside the city for a life of complete his face, radiant with a contentment that the ASC spiritual practices. When northern India, on this unexpected the face of such obvious serenity and response became legendary. The holy man Kamentidik had spent decades trying to achieve through to water his vegetables. While material loss, Don Raj's among spiritual seekers throughout, once told me that attachment revered teacher, Don Raj said, continuing, but not in the way either to wealth was the chain that bound me to suffering. You speaking? You were absolutely correct. Possessions disappeared. I discovered that I am the time. The belief that I was separate from that was expressing itself temporarily of us, understood at abundance that flows through all existence. When my absence, the ascetic stood in confused chain was never the wealth itself, but my not someone who has wealth or lacks wealth. I am the very abundance through those possessions, and is now expressing itself through his gentle teaching. The pieced silence as Don Raj continue in this moment did the peace I thought I could find through spiritual practice while maintaining worldly success are the same peace that you seek through renunciation and his present conditions. It is what achieve or fail to achieve. The kingdom, regardless of what we enter, we could never stop right now. Of truth you, by meeting certain own or don't own, spoke of is not something we are, what we have always been. What being, even if we tried, Nind. This encounter marked the beginning of a new chapter in Don Raj's life, though he would have been the first to point out that nothing had actually begun and nothing had actually changed except his recognition of what had been true all along. People began coming from great distances to sit with the merchant who had found enlightenment through losing everything, though he always insisted that he had not lost anything real and had not found anything that had not always been present. His simple home became an informal gathering place where seekers could discover that the spiritual treasures they were pursuing were not hidden in distant caves or complex practices, but were as available as their next breath, as present as their own awareness, as abundant as the love that flows through every moment when we stop trying to grasp it and simply allow it to flow through us. And so our fourth story completes itself like the natural cycle of seasons, carrying us from the apparent complexity of seeking spiritual truth while living in the material world to the profound simplicity of recognizing that we are the truth we seek. We are the abundance we desire. We are the peace that no external circumstances can disturb or provide. As we turn now to our fifth tale, let us journey to the mist-covered mountains of ancient Korea, where monasteries clung to cliff sides like birds' nests, built of stone and devotion. This is the story of the monk who could not remember, and the master who taught him that forgetting can be the most profound form of remembering. A teaching that reveals how our greatest perceived weaknesses often contain the seeds of our deepest wisdom. High in the Taebaek Mountains, where winter winds carved sculptures from ice and summer rains painted waterfalls down granite faces, stood the monastery of Bulguksa, renowned throughout the peninsula for its rigorous scholarship and the intellectual brilliance of its monks. Students came from across the kingdom to study the vast collection of Buddhist texts housed in its library, memorizing sutras with the dedication that others might bring to mastering swordsmanship or poetry. Among these devoted scholars lived a young monk named Minsu, whose sincere desire to understand the Dharma was matched only by his complete inability to retain anything he studied. While his fellow students could recite entire chapters of the Lotus Sutra after reading them once, Minsu would struggle to remember even simple verses after weeks of concentrated effort. His mind seemed to be made of water, unable to hold on to the precious teachings that flowed through it like streams cascading down the mountainside. Each morning, Minsu would rise before dawn to begin his studies, lighting oil lamps in the cold library, while other monks still slept peacefully in their cells. He would trace each character with his finger, repeat each phrase until his voice grew hoarse, and fill pages with careful notes that he hoped might serve as external memory for his failing internal one. Yet by evening, the teachings that had seemed so clear in the morning would have evaporated like mist touched by the sun. The other monks, while not unkind, could barely hide their puzzlement at Minsu's struggles. How could someone with such obvious devotion and such genuine longing for understanding be so completely unable to master the basic requirements of monastic education? Some suggested gently that perhaps Minsu would be better suited to the life of a simple laborer, tending the monastery gardens or maintaining the buildings, rather than attempting scholarly pursuits that seemed beyond his capacity. These well-meaning suggestions cut deeply into Minsu's heart, not because he felt superior to manual labor, but because he genuinely hungered for the wisdom contained in the sacred texts. Night after night, he would lie on his sleeping mat, listening to the soft breathing of his fellow monks, tormented by the feeling that he was somehow fundamentally deficient, lacking some essential quality that would allow him to walk the path of understanding that others navigated with such apparent ease. His struggles reached a crisis point during the monastery's annual examination period, when each monk was required to demonstrate his mastery of the previous year's studies through detailed recitation and commentary. While other students prepared with confident anticipation, Minsu faced the approaching tests with growing dread. He had studied the same texts as everyone else, had spent more hours in the library than perhaps any other monk, yet when he tried to recall specific passages or philosophical arguments, his mind remained frustratingly blank. The night before his examination, Minsu sat alone in the moonlit courtyard, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of night insects and the distant murmur of wind through pine trees. He had given up all pretense of last-minute studying, knowing that no amount of effort at this point could overcome months of failed retention. Instead, he found himself simply sitting in the presence of his own defeat, no longer fighting against his limitations, but allowing them to be exactly what they were. As he sat in this space of complete surrender, something unexpected began to happen. Without trying to remember anything specific, without straining to recall particular teachings or philosophical concepts, Minsu found himself aware of a profound silence that seemed to contain everything the texts had been pointing toward. It was as if all the words he had been unable to retain had dissolved into their essential meaning, leaving behind not emptiness, but a fullness that needed no concepts to support it. When morning came and the examination began, Minsu approached the testing hall with a calm he had never experienced before. The examining master, Venerable Hyagong, was known throughout the monastery for his encyclopedic knowledge and his ability to expose any gaps in a student's understanding through penetrating questions. When Minsu's turn arrived, the master began with a standard inquiry about the nature of Buddha mind as described in the Avatamsaka Sutra. Instead of the detailed textual analysis that was expected, Minsu found himself responding from the silence he had touched the night before. His words were simple, free from scholarly terminology, yet they carried a directness and authenticity that caused Venerable Hyagong to lean forward with sudden interest. When asked about the relationship between form and emptiness, Minsu could not quote the classical explanations, but he spoke from a place of immediate understanding that made the ancient concepts suddenly alive and present. The examination continued for nearly an hour, far longer than usual, as the master probed deeper and deeper into Minsu's understanding. Each question revealed the same pattern. The young monk could not recite the traditional formulations, could not reference specific texts or quote revered commentaries, yet his responses demonstrated a grasp of the essential teachings that surpassed mere intellectual comprehension. When the examination concluded, Venerable Hyagong sat in contemplative silence for several long moments. Finally, he spoke words that would become legendary within the monastery. Minsu, in your forgetting, you have remembered what most of us lose in our remembering. Your mind that cannot hold on to words has somehow grasped the wordless truth they were meant to convey. Or the other monks, who had been expecting to witness Minsu's inevitable failure, found themselves instead confronting a mystery that challenged their understanding of how wisdom is acquired and retained. How could someone who appeared to know nothing demonstrate understanding that seemed to flow from the very source of the teachings themselves? Word of the extraordinary examination spread quickly through the monastery, reaching even the elderly abbot who rarely involved himself in the daily affairs of student testing. Abbot Wanhyo, whose own awakening decades earlier had come through questioning rather than accepting conventional approaches to practice, requested a private meeting with the young monk, whose failure had apparently revealed a different kind of success. When Minsu entered the abbot's simple quarters, expecting perhaps to receive counseling about his academic limitations, he found instead a teacher whose eyes sparkled with the recognition of someone who had discovered an unexpected treasure. "Tell me, Minsu," the abbot said with genuine curiosity, "what do you think is the purpose of studying the sutras?" The young monk considered the question carefully before responding with the same directness he had shown during his examination. "I used to think the purpose was to fill my mind with the Buddha's teachings, to accumulate knowledge that would lead to understanding. But now I wonder if the real purpose might be to empty my mind of everything that prevents me from seeing what the Buddha was pointing toward. This response delighted the abbot, who had spent years watching brilliant students become so enamored with their intellectual mastery of Buddhist concepts that they missed the living reality those concepts were meant to reveal. "And what prevents us from seeing what the Buddha was pointing toward?" he asked, already sensing what the answer would be. "Perhaps," Minsu replied thoughtfully. "It is the very effort to grasp and hold on to something that can only be lived, never possessed. Maybe my inability to remember the teachings has forced me to meet them fresh in each moment, without the burden of accumulated concepts that might otherwise stand between me and direct experience." The conversation continued deep into the night, as the abbot recognized that he was in the presence of someone who had stumbled into a profound understanding that could benefit the entire monastery community. Minsu's apparent disability had become his greatest gift. His failure to meet conventional standards had opened a doorway to unconventional wisdom, and his empty memory had become a vessel for immediate presence that most scholars spend lifetimes trying to achieve. From that night forward, Minsu's role in the monastery transformed completely. Instead of struggling to catch up with his more academically gifted peers, he became a teacher in his own right, though his teaching style bore no resemblance to the traditional lectures and textual analysis that characterized formal Buddhist education. Students began seeking him out not for help memorizing sutras, but for guidance in accessing the living wisdom those sutras contained. His teaching method was as unique as his path to understanding had been. Rather than explaining concepts, he would ask questions that invited students to look beyond their accumulated knowledge to their direct experience. Instead of providing answers, he would create spaces of silence where insights could arise naturally. When students brought him complex philosophical problems, he would often respond with such simplicity that the artificial complexity of their questions would dissolve, revealing the elegant truth that had been hidden beneath layers of conceptual elaboration. One of his most devoted students, a brilliant scholar named Jisoo, who had previously taken pride in his ability to quote entire treatises from memory, experienced his own breakthrough during a session with Minsu. Jisoo had been struggling with doubt about his practice, feeling that despite all his intellectual understanding, he had never touched the heart of what the Buddha was teaching. "Master," Jisoo said, using the title that had begun to feel natural despite Minsu's humble protests, "I know all the texts that describe enlightenment, but I have never experienced what they describe. How can I move from knowing about awakening to actually awakening?" Instead of providing the kind of detailed analysis that Jisoo expected, Minsu simply asked, "Right now, in this moment, what is it that knows you are doubting?" The question stopped Jisoo completely. He had been so focused on enlightenment as something to be achieved in the future that he had never noticed the awareness that was already present, the consciousness that was witnessing his very seeking. "This knowing that you speak of," Jisoo said slowly, "it's not something I need to find. It's what I am." Minsu smiled with the joy of a teacher watching a student discover their own treasure. "And has this knowing ever been absent? Has there ever been a moment when you were not aware, even if what you were aware of was confusion or seeking or doubt?" This simple exchange, lasting perhaps 10 minutes, accomplished what years of study had not been able to provide. Jisoo's relationship to his spiritual practice transformed from seeking something he lacked to recognizing what had never been absent. His scholarly knowledge, rather than being abandoned, became a tool for pointing others toward the same recognition, its concepts now rooted in lived understanding rather than mere intellectual comprehension. Stories of such transformations began to attract attention from other monasteries throughout Korea. Teachers and students made pilgrimages to Bulguksa not to study with the famous scholars in its library, but to spend time with the monk who had learned to teach through not knowing, who had discovered wisdom through forgetting, who had found the pathless path by admitting he was lost. Minsu himself remained unchanged by this growing recognition, continuing to approach each day with the same humility and openness that had characterized his struggles as a failing student. When visitors asked him to explain his teaching method or share the secret of his understanding, he would invariably disappoint them by insisting that he had no method and no understanding to share. "I am still the same monk who cannot remember the sutras," he would say with gentle humor. "The only difference is that I have stopped seeing this as a problem. When you stop trying to grasp what cannot be grasped, when you stop trying to remember what was never forgotten, what remains is simply this moment, this breath, this awareness that needs nothing added to it to be complete." Years passed, and Minsu's reputation as a teacher of the pathless path spread throughout the Buddhist world. Yet he continued to live with the same simplicity that had marked his early years as a struggling student. He would still be found in the library each morning, not studying texts, but simply sitting in appreciation of the silence that lived between the words. His presence there became a teaching in itself, showing others that wisdom and ignorance were not opposites to be resolved, but complementary aspects of the same unlimited awareness. The monastery's approach to education gradually evolved to include what became known as the way of not knowing, a recognition that intellectual understanding, while valuable, was only one pathway to the truth the texts were meant to convey. Students were encouraged not only to study and memorize, but also to sit with what they could not understand, to embrace their confusion as a doorway rather than an obstacle, to find in their failures the very teachings they had been seeking through their successes. One autumn evening, as golden leaves fell like prayers outside the library windows, Minsu sat with a group of students who had been struggling with the concept of emptiness, as described in the Prajnaparamita literature. They had read all the commentaries, memorized the classical explanations, yet still felt that the essential meaning eluded their grasp. "Perhaps," Minsu suggested gently, "the teaching of emptiness cannot be understood by the mind that seeks to fill itself with concepts. Maybe it can only be recognized by the mind that is willing to remain empty, open, available to receive what is already present but cannot be captured in words." As he spoke, his own mind exemplified the teaching he was offering. Free from the burden of accumulated knowledge, present to the moment without the filter of remembered concepts, his awareness rested in the very emptiness the texts described. In his presence, students could taste directly what all their studying had been pointing toward. The teaching that emerged from Minsu's unique path became known as the Dharma of Forgetting, though he always insisted this was a misleading name. "We are not learning to forget," he would clarify. "We are learning to remember what we are beneath everything we think we need to remember. We are discovering the awareness that is present before any knowledge arises, the understanding that exists prior to all understanding." As our fifth story finds its natural completion, like the gentle settling of leaves that have fallen from the tree of memory, we carry with us Minsu's profound discovery that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer the world is not what we know, but our willingness to rest in the unknowing that is more spacious than any concept, more present than any memory, more complete than any accumulation of wisdom could ever be. Let us now venture into our sixth tale, which comes to us from the ancient spice routes of Persia, where caravans carried not only precious goods, but stories that would outlive empires. This is the story of the merchant's daughter who lost her voice and found her song, a teaching about how our deepest expressions sometimes require the silence of everything we thought we needed to say. In the great trading city of Isfahan, where blue-tiled domes caught the desert sun and merchants from distant lands gathered in bazaars filled with the music of a dozen languages, there lived a successful spice trader named Rostam, whose greatest treasure was not his warehouses filled with cardamom and saffron, but his daughter Gulshan, whose voice was said to be more beautiful than the nightingales that sang in the city's rose gardens. From her earliest childhood, Gulshan had possessed a gift for music that seemed to flow directly from her soul. Her singing could bring tears to the eyes of hardened caravan leaders and cause market vendors to pause in their haggling simply to listen to melodies that seemed to carry the essence of beauty itself. Her father, recognizing her extraordinary talent, had hired the finest music teachers in the region, masters who had trained the court musicians of kings, and who declared that Gulshan's abilities surpassed any they had encountered. As she grew into young womanhood, Gulshan's reputation spread throughout Persia and beyond. Poets wrote verses comparing her voice to everything from flowing water to ascending prayers, and noble families would send generous gifts, hoping to persuade her to perform at their celebrations. She had developed a repertoire of songs from across the known world, from the haunting melodies of the northern steppes to the complex rhythms of the southern kingdoms, each one transformed by her unique ability to find the emotional heart of any musical tradition. Yet despite this extraordinary gift and the acclaim it brought her, Gulshan felt increasingly troubled by a growing sense that something essential was missing from her musical expression. Her technique was flawless, her voice pure and powerful, her interpretation sophisticated and moving. But somewhere in the depths of her heart, she sensed that her singing, beautiful as it was, somehow remained on the surface of what music might truly be capable of expressing. This feeling deepened during her performances at the grandest occasions, where her voice would soar over audiences of hundreds, receiving thunderous applause and lavish praise from the most discerning listeners. In those moments of greatest triumph, when her technical mastery was most evident and her artistry most celebrated, she would often feel most disconnected from the source of authentic expression that she sensed existed somewhere beyond all the training and technique she had accumulated. The crisis that would transform everything began on a spring morning, when Gulshan woke to discover that her voice had simply vanished. Not weakened or hoarse, but completely absent, as if the gift that had defined her entire identity had been withdrawn overnight, without warning or explanation. She could move her lips. She could feel air passing through her throat, but no sound emerged, not even a whisper. Her father immediately summoned the finest physicians in Isfahan, learned men who examined her throat with careful attention and prescribed various remedies for what they assumed must be some form of temporary ailment. They gave her herbal teas to soothe inflammation that they could not detect, recommended steam treatments for congestion that was not present, and suggested complete vocal rest to heal damage they could not identify. Days stretched into weeks, and still no sound came from Gulshan's throat. The silence where her voice had once lived became a presence unto itself, more profound and mysterious than any song she had ever sung. Her music teachers came to offer advice and encouragement, but their suggestions felt increasingly irrelevant to her condition. which seemed to exist beyond the realm of technique or training. As the weeks of silence extended into months, something remarkable began to happen. Deprived of her primary means of expression, Gulshan found herself listening with an intensity she had never experienced before. The world, which had previously served mainly as an audience for her performances, revealed itself as an infinite symphony of sounds and silences that she had been too busy singing to truly hear. She began to notice the music that existed everywhere around her, the rhythming of Kimik hamoppersmiths in the bazaar, the call and response between mothers and children in the courtyards, the whispered prayers that rose from the mosque at sunset, the laughter of water flowing through the garden channels. Each sound seemed to carry its own perfect melody, its own irreplaceable contribution to the vast composition of daily life. More profoundly, in the depths of her enforced silence, Gulshan discovered a quality of inner listening that she had never known existed. Beneath the constant chatter of her thoughts, beneath the memories of all the songs she had learned and the anticipation of songs she might someday sing again, there existed a vast space of alert stillness that seemed to be the source from which all music arose and to which it ultimately returned. This inner silence was not empty or absent, but vibrantly alive, pregnant with infinite possibilities for expression. It was like discovering that beneath the surface waves of a lake lay depths that reflected the sky with a clarity that the moving water could never achieve. In this profound quiet, she began to understand that her previous singing, beautiful as it had somehow been covering up the very source of beauty it was meant to express. 6 months after losing her voice, Gulshan experienced a moment that would change not only her understanding of music, but her entire approach to living. She was sitting in her father's garden at dawn, listening to the first birds beginning their morning songs, when she suddenly heard something that stopped her completely. Woven through the melody of the nightingales, she could hear her own voice, not as sound produced by her throat, but as a quality of listening so complete and loving that it became itself a form of singing. In that moment, she realized that she had never lost her voice at all. Instead, she had discovered that her true voice was not something she possessed, but something she was. Not something that came from her, but something she could become. The silence that had seemed like the absence of her gift revealed itself as the presence of a far greater capacity for musical expression than she had ever imagined possible. When her physical voice finally returned, arriving as mysteriously as it had departed, it carried with it the profound silence she had discovered during the months of its absence. Her singing was transformed completely, no longer a display of technical mastery or emotional interpretation, but a direct transmission of the vast stillness that lives at the heart of all sound. Audiences would find themselves moved to tears, not by the beauty of her voice, but by the quality of presence that her voice revealed in them. Her first performance after the return of her voice took place in the same garden where she had discovered her true song. She sang a simple melody, one of the first she had learned as a child, but it carried such depth and authenticity that the small gathering of family and friends who heard it felt they were witnessing not just a musical performance, but a sacred revelation of what human expression could become when rooted in complete presence rather than personal achievement. Word of this transformation spread quickly through the musical communities of Persia and beyond. Musicians and music lovers made pilgrimages to Isfahan not to hear Gulshan's technical brilliance, but to experience the profound stillness that her singing revealed. Her performances became less like concerts and more like meditations, spaces where listeners could discover in themselves the same vast silence that had become the source of her renewed artistry. She began teaching other musicians, though her method bore no resemblance to traditional musical instruction. Instead of focusing on technique or interpretation, she would guide students into the same quality of inner listening that had transformed her own relationship to sound. Many discovered that their most powerful musical expressions arose not from adding something to their performance, but from removing the barriers that prevented their authentic voice from emerging naturally. One of her most dedicated students was a young man named Darius, a talented musician who had become so frustrated with his inability to move audiences the way Gulshan did that he had nearly abandoned music altogether. When he came to study with her, expecting to learn some secret technique or special method, she began their first lesson by asking him to sit in complete silence for an hour, simply listening to whatever sounds arose around them. "But I came here to learn to sing," Darius protested. "How will sitting quietly teach me anything about music?" Gulshan's response became one of her most quoted teachings. "The music you wish to express is not something you need to learn. It is something you need to remember. And what you need to remember can only be heard in the silence between the notes, in the space between the thoughts, in the listening that exists before any sound arises." During that hour of silent listening, Darius experienced something that his years of musical training had never provided. He began to hear not just the external sounds around him, but the quality of awareness that was hearing them. This awareness, he realized, was itself a form of music, a constant symphony of presence that needed no instrument to express itself and no technique to perfect itself. When he finally did begin to sing that day, his voice carried a quality it had never possessed before. The same technical abilities were present, but they now served a deeper purpose, becoming vehicles for the silence he had touched, rather than attempts to fill that silence with impressive sounds. His music became a bridge between the vast stillness that lives within every listener and the world of form and sound that seems to exist outside them. Gulshan's teaching attracted attention from spiritual teachers as well as musicians, as they recognized that her approach to musical expression was actually a profound method for accessing the same presence that mystics sought through prayer and meditation. Music became a doorway to the divine, not through the complexity of its arrangements or the skill of its performance, but through the quality of listening and presence that both performer and audience could discover in the space where sound and silence met. Her father's house became an informal conservatory where the boundaries between music, spirituality, and daily life began to dissolve. Students would arrive expecting vocal lessons and find themselves engaging in practices that transformed not only their singing, but their entire approach to living. The silence that Gulshan had discovered during her months without voice became a teaching tool more powerful than any technique or method could ever be. Years later, when Gulshan had become renowned throughout the Islamic world, not just as a singer, but as a teacher of presence, she would often reflect on the gift that her apparent loss of voice had provided. "I thought my voice was something I had," she would tell her students. "The silence taught me that my voice is something I am." When we stop trying to possess our gifts and instead allow them to possess us completely, they reveal their true nature as expressions of the infinite creativity that flows through all existence. The story of Gulshan's transformation became legendary among musicians and spiritual seekers alike, carrying within it the profound teaching that our greatest expressions often emerge not from what we add to our natural abilities, but from what we are willing to remove, that might be obscuring their authentic manifestation. Her life demonstrated that the silence we sometimes fear as the absence of our gifts may actually be their deepest presence, waiting patiently for us to discover that what we are seeking is not something we need to create, but something we need to allow. As our sixth story draws to its close like the final note of a perfect song dissolving into the silence from which it arose, we carry with us Gulshan's discovery that our truest voice emerges not from the sounds we make, but from the quality of listening we bring to the vast symphony of existence that is always playing both within us and around us, waiting for us to become still enough to hear the music we have always been singing. Now let us journey to the mountains of ancient Tibet, where the air grows thin, and the boundary between earth and sky seems to dissolve into the endless expanse of blue. This is our seventh tale, the story of the monk who was afraid of heights and the mountain that taught him to fly, a teaching about how our deepest fears often guard the doorway to our greatest freedoms. In the remote reaches of the Himalayas, where peaks pierce clouds like prayers reaching toward infinity, stood the monastery of Sami Ling, perched on a narrow ledge carved from living rock thousands of feet above the valley floor. The monastery was famous throughout Tibet, not only for the profound wisdom of its teachings, but for the extraordinary courage required simply to reach its gates, as the only path to its entrance wound along precipitous cliff faces where a single misstep meant certain death. Among the monks who called this aerial sanctuary home was a young man named Tenzin, whose devotion to the Dharma was matched only by his paralyzing terror of heights. This might have seemed an insurmountable obstacle to spiritual practice in such a location. Yet Tenzin had somehow managed to make the treacherous journey to Sami Ling, and had been living there for 3 years, though his existence was severely constrained by the very geography that inspired others. While his fellow monks would venture out onto the monastery's many terraces and balconies to practice walking meditation, with the vast expanse of mountains stretching endlessly around them, Tenzin remained confined to the innermost rooms, never approaching any window or doorway that might reveal the dizzying drop that surrounded their mountain home. His fear was so intense that even the sound of wind across the peaks could trigger waves of nausea and panic that would leave him trembling for hours. The other monks, while compassionate toward Tenzin's obvious suffering, found themselves puzzled by his choice to remain in a place that caused him such distress. The monastery's location was considered one of its greatest blessings, a physical manifestation of the spiritual principle of rising above worldly concerns to dwell in the rarefied atmosphere of pure awareness. How could someone practice the teachings of transcendence while trapped by such a fundamental limitation? Tenzin himself was tormented by this contradiction. He had come to Sami Ling because he had heard stories of the profound teachings available there, instructions that could guide sincere seekers to the very heights of realization. Yet here he was, unable even to approach the literal heights where much of the monastery's life unfolded. He felt like a bird with clipped wings, forever earthbound while surrounded by those who soared freely in the limitless space of awakened awareness. His fear had roots that stretched back to his childhood in a valley village far below, where he had witnessed his elder brother fall from a cliff while gathering medicinal herbs. The image of that plummeting figure, the sound of his mother's wail of grief, the sight of the broken body retrieved from the rocks below had etched itself so deeply into Tenzin's consciousness that any reminder of height or falling would instantly transport him back to that moment of devastating loss. The head lama of the monastery, Rinpoche Norbu, was renowned for his ability to see through the surface manifestations of his students' struggles to the deeper teachings that lay hidden within their apparent obstacles. He had been quietly observing Tenzin's self-imposed imprisonment for months, recognizing that the young monk's fear represented not just a personal limitation, but a profound teaching opportunity that could benefit the entire community. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and rose, Rinpoche Norbu appeared at Tenzin's cell with an unexpected invitation. "Come," he said simply, his voice carrying the gentle authority that made refusal impossible. "It is time for your real education to begin." When Tenzin hesitated, already sensing that this invitation might lead him toward the very thing he most dreaded, the Rinpoche added with a knowing smile, "Do not worry. We will go only as far as your fear allows." This last comment puzzled Tenzin, as it seemed to suggest that his fear itself might serve as a guide rather than an obstacle. With great trepidation, but unable to refuse his teacher's request, he followed Rinpoche Norbu through the monastery's winding corridors, his anxiety increasing with each step that seemed to lead toward the outer walls and the terrible emptiness beyond. To his surprise, however, they stopped at a small room deep within the monastery's interior, a simple space that contained nothing but two meditation cushions facing each other. "Sit," the Rinpoche instructed, settling onto his own cushion with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "Tell me about your fear, not the story of how it began, but what it feels like right now in your body, right now in this moment." This question caught Tenzin off guard. He had expected to be challenged to overcome his fear, to be pushed toward confronting heights through some form of exposure or discipline. Instead, he was being asked to examine the fear itself with the same careful attention he might bring to studying a sacred text. As he settled into meditation posture, he began to notice sensations that had become so familiar he had stopped observing them consciously. "There is a tightness in my chest," he began hesitantly, "like a fist clenched around my heart. My breathing becomes shallow, almost as if the air itself has grown thin. My stomach feels hollow yet heavy at the same time, and there is a sensation like falling even when I am sitting perfectly still on solid ground." Rinpoche Norbu nodded with interest. "And this falling sensation, can you describe it more precisely? Where in your body do you experience it? How does it move or change as you observe it?" These questions invited Tenzin to investigate his fear with a precision he had never applied to it before, transforming his relationship to the experience from victim to curious observer. As he examined the sensations more closely, something remarkable began to happen. The falling sensation, which had always felt like evidence of actual danger, began to reveal itself as simply another arising phenomenon in consciousness, no different from the feeling of hunger or the sound of bells echoing through the monastery halls. By observing it with patient attention, rather than immediately trying to escape from it, he discovered that even the most intense fear had boundaries, fluctuations, and a tendency to change when met with accepting awareness. "Now," Rinpoche Norbu continued, "I want you to imagine that this falling sensation is not something happening to you, but something you are doing. What if this fear of falling is actually your mind's way of practicing falling? What if the terror you experience is preparation for an actual fall that has nothing to do with physical heights?" This suggestion opened an entirely new perspective for Tenzin. Perhaps his fear of literal falling was somehow connected to a deeper resistance to the kind of spiritual falling that the path of awakening required. The willingness to let go of all fixed reference points and allow consciousness to free fall through the groundless space of pure awareness. The insight that emerged from this reflection would transform not only Tenzin's relationship to his phobia, but his entire approach to spiritual practice. He began to understand that his terror of heights might be an exaggerated version of the natural resistance that everyone experiences when faced with the ultimate letting go that awakening demands. His fear, rather than being a personal failing, might actually be his psyche's way of preparing him for the most profound surrender possible. Over the following weeks, Rinpoche Norbu guided Tenzin through a series of meditation practices designed to help him explore the inner geography of falling. Instead of trying to overcome his fear, they began to use it as a doorway into understanding the nature of ego dissolution and the groundless freedom that mystics throughout history had described as the essence of enlightenment. In your meditation, the Rinpoche instructed, instead of trying to feel safe and grounded, I want you to deliberately invoke the sensation of falling. Allow your awareness to free fall through space, with no bottom to catch you, no solid ground to provide security. Let go completely, and discover what remains when there is nothing left to hold on to. This practice terrified Tenzin initially, as it seemed to be voluntarily entering the very state he had spent years trying to avoid. Yet as he worked with it day after day, always within the safety of the interior meditation hall, he began to discover something extraordinary. The falling sensation that had always felt like dissolution and death began to reveal itself as a gateway to a kind of freedom he had never imagined possible. In the deepest moments of these meditation sessions, when he allowed his awareness to plummet through inner space without any attempt to grab onto reference points or solid ground, Tenzin would sometimes touch a state of consciousness that was vast beyond description. In this falling, he found not the destruction of himself that he had always feared, but the discovery of a self so spacious and unlimited that the very concept of falling became meaningless. After months of this inner work, Rinpoche Norbu made another surprising suggestion. Now, he said, it is time to bring your practice to the place where it can be fully tested. Tomorrow at dawn, we will sit together on the monastery's highest balcony, and you will practice falling while surrounded by the very heights that have held you prisoner for so long. The night before this proposed meeting, Tenzin barely slept. Every meditation technique he had learned, every insight he had gained, every moment of inner freedom he had tasted seemed to evaporate in the face of the actual prospect of approaching the monastery's edge. Yet when dawn arrived, he found himself following his teacher through corridors he had avoided for years, toward a doorway that opened onto the vast emptiness of mountain sky. As they approached the balcony, Tenzin's familiar symptoms began to arise with overwhelming intensity. His chest tightened, his breathing grew shallow, and the sensation of falling began to grip his entire body. But this time, instead of running from these experiences, he had tools to work with them. He began to apply the meditation instructions he had been practicing, allowing the falling sensation to become a conscious, falling into the groundless awareness he had discovered in the safety of the interior hall. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As they stepped onto the balcony, and Tenzin's eyes took in the incredible vista of peaks stretching to every horizon, the familiar terror arose with such intensity that his ordinary consciousness simply could not maintain its usual patterns of resistance and control. In that moment of complete overwhelm, something clicked, and he found himself dropping into the meditative falling state more completely than he had ever achieved during his protected practice sessions. Standing on that narrow ledge thousands of feet above the valley floor, surrounded by the infinity of mountain space that had once symbolized everything he most feared, Tenzin discovered something that would change his understanding of both fear and freedom forever. The physical heights that had terrorized him for years suddenly revealed themselves as perfect external reflections of the inner heights of consciousness that meditation had been pointing him toward all along. In that moment of recognition, his relationship to the mountains transformed completely. The dizzying drop below became not a threat, but an invitation to experience the same kind of boundless openness in his awareness. The vast sky around him became not a reminder of dangerous emptiness, but a mirror reflecting the limitless nature of his own mind when freed from the constraints of small, fearful thinking. The laughter that arose from deep within his chest carried with it years of accumulated tension releasing all at once. He realized that he had been afraid not of falling, but of flying. His terror of heights had been his psyche's way of protecting him from discovering the kind of freedom that would make his old, limited way of living impossible to maintain. From that morning forward, Tenzin became one of the monastery's most adventurous inhabitants. He could be found practicing meditation on the narrowest ledges, teaching other monks the techniques he had learned for transforming fear into doorways to freedom, and serving as a living example of how our greatest limitations can become our most powerful teachers when met with the right understanding and guidance. His story spread throughout Tibet as an inspiration to anyone struggling with fears that seemed to limit their spiritual development. Monks and lay practitioners would make pilgrimages to Sami Ling, not only to receive traditional teachings, but to learn from the monk who had discovered how to transform terror into transcendence, how to find in the very thing that seemed to imprison him the key to liberation that he had been seeking all along. The teaching that emerged from Tenzin's transformation became known as the practice of sacred falling, a recognition that the ego's death that spiritual awakening requires can be approached not as something to be feared and resisted, but as the most natural and joyful expression of our deepest nature returning to its source. Students learn to identify their own versions of the fear of heights, their own resistance to the falling that freedom requires, and to use these fears as meditation objects that could guide them toward the very liberation they were unconsciously avoiding. Years later, when Tenzin had become a teacher renowned throughout the Himalayan region for his ability to help others transform their deepest fears into pathways to awakening, he would often reflect on the profound gift that his apparent limitation had provided. Standing on the monastery's highest balcony, now completely at ease in the vast space that once had terrified him, he would tell his students, "Fear is just love wearing a disguise. What we most fear is often what we most need to embrace. The heights we avoid are usually the heights we are meant to climb." As our seventh story finds its completion like a bird, settling gently after soaring through mountain peaks, we carry with us Tenzin's precious discovery that our fears are not obstacles to our freedom, but guardians protecting the very treasures we seek, waiting patiently for us to develop the courage and wisdom necessary to claim the gifts they have been keeping safe for us. Our eighth tale takes us to the ancient Silk Roads of Central Asia, where merchants and mystics crossed paths in desert oases under star-filled skies. This is the story of the caravan master who lost his way and discovered that being lost was the only true direction, a teaching about how our moments of deepest confusion often carry within them the seeds of our clearest understanding. In the vast expanse of the Gobi Desert, where sand dunes shifted like thoughts across the landscape of eternity, there lived a caravan master named Jamyang, whose reputation for navigating the treacherous trade routes was legendary throughout the known world. For 30 years, He had guided merchant caravans safely across thousands of miles of desert, memorizing every landmark, every water source, every subtle sign that could mean the difference between life and death in that unforgiving wilderness. Jamyang possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the desert's moods. He could predict sandstorms days before they arrived, locate water by the flight patterns of birds invisible to others, and navigate by stars so faint that most travelers could not even see them. Merchants would pay enormous sums to secure his services, knowing that a caravan led by Jamyang would arrive at its destination not only safely, but often ahead of schedule, having found shortcuts and favorable conditions that no other guide could have discovered. His success had brought him wealth and respect, but more importantly, it had given him a deep sense of purpose and identity. Jamyang knew who he was. He was the man who never got lost, the guide who could find direction in any circumstance, the master of pathways that others found impossibly complex. This identity had become so central to his being that he could not imagine himself apart from his role as the infallible navigator of impossible terrain. His confidence was absolute until the morning when everything he thought he knew about direction, navigation, and his own capabilities dissolved into the shimmering heat mirages that danced across the desert horizon. He was leading a particularly valuable caravan, carrying silk and precious stones from the eastern kingdoms to the trading centers of the West, when he made a discovery that shattered his understanding of everything he had built his life upon. The caravan had stopped for their midday rest at what Jamyang believed to be a familiar oasis, a place he had visited dozens of times over the years. But as he walked around the small spring to check the water quality, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The rock formations were wrong. The arrangement of palm trees didn't match his memories. Even the taste of the water was subtly different from what he expected. For the first time in 3 decades of desert travel, Jamyang realized with growing horror that he had no idea where they were. Somehow, despite following what he was certain were familiar landmarks, despite navigating by stars he had read like a beloved book for years, despite using all the skills that had made him the most trusted guide in Central Asia, he had led his caravan into completely unknown territory. The initial shock gave way to a frantic effort to re-establish his bearings. He climbed the highest dunes around the oasis, scanning the horizon for any recognizable feature. He checked and rechecked his instruments, studied the sun's position, consulted the maps that had served him faithfully for years. But nothing corresponded to anything he knew. It was as if the desert itself had rearranged itself while he slept, creating an entirely new landscape that bore no relationship to the geography he had mastered. As hours passed without any progress in determining their location, Jamyang faced a crisis that went far deeper than mere navigation difficulties. His entire sense of self began to crumble along with his confidence in his abilities. If he was not the man who could always find the way, then who was he? If his knowledge and experience were useless in this situation, then what value did he possess? For the first time since childhood, he felt completely and utterly helpless. The merchants in his caravan, initially patient and understanding, began to grow anxious as they realized the severity of their predicament. These were men who had invested their life savings in the goods they carried, who had families depending on the successful completion of this trading journey. Their trust in Jamyang had been absolute, based on his reputation and their own previous successful ventures under his guidance. Now that trust was transforming into fear and increasingly into anger. "How can the great Jamyang be lost?" one merchant demanded, his voice carrying the edge of panic. We paid you precisely because you never get lost. Our fortunes, our very lives depend on your ability to guide us safely to our destination. The weight of this responsibility, which had once filled Jamyang with pride, now pressed down on him like a physical burden that threatened to crush his spirit entirely. That night, as the caravan settled into uneasy sleep around their small fire, Jamyang walked alone into the darkness beyond the oasis. The stars above, once his trusted companions and reliable guides, now seemed to mock him with their silent indifference. He had always found comfort in the vast emptiness of the desert night. But now that emptiness felt like a mirror, reflecting his own profound disorientation and loss of purpose, as he sat on a small rise of sand, surrounded by the infinite darkness that stretched in every direction. Something unexpected began to happen. The panic and self-recrimination that had been consuming him throughout the day gradually gave way to a different kind of awareness. In the depths of his complete lostness, he began to notice something he had never perceived during all his years of confident navigation: the profound aliveness of the desert itself. Without the constant mental activity of calculating directions, identifying landmarks, and planning routes, Jamyang found his attention naturally turning to immediate sensory experience. He became aware of the subtle sounds that filled the seemingly silent night. The whisper of sand shifting in gentle breezes, the distant call of a night bird, the soft breathing of camels and sleeping merchants back at the oasis. Each sound seemed to carry its own perfect intelligence, its own way of being exactly where it belonged in the vast symphony of desert life. More remarkably, as he released his desperate attempts to figure out where they were and how to get where they were going, he began to experience a kind of peace that had been absent from his life for decades. The constant pressure of being responsible for finding the way, of maintaining his reputation as the infallible guide, of carrying other people's trust and expectations, simply dissolved into the vastness of the star-filled sky above him. In that moment of complete surrender to being utterly lost, Jamyang discovered something that would transform not only his understanding of navigation, but his entire approach to living. He realized that all his years of successful guiding had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of direction itself. He had been trying to impose his limited human knowledge onto the infinite intelligence of the desert, rather than learning to listen to the deeper guidance that was always available but could only be heard when the mind stopped its constant chatter about where it thought it should be going. As dawn approached, painting the eastern horizon in shades of pearl and gold, Jamyang made his way back to the oasis with a completely different relationship to their situation. Instead of seeing their lostness as a problem to be solved through the application of knowledge and technique, he began to experience it as an invitation to discover a different kind of navigation, one based on present moment awareness rather than accumulated information. When the caravan members woke and gathered around him expectantly, hoping that the night had brought him some insight about their location, Jamyang surprised them with a response unlike anything they had ever heard from their previously confident guide. "My friends," he said with a calmness that seemed to emerge from some deep source of certainty, "I must tell you honestly that I do not know where we are, and I do not know which direction will lead us to our destination." The merchants looked at each other with growing alarm, but before panic could set in completely, Jamyang continued, "However, I have discovered something far more valuable than knowing where we are. I have learned how to listen to the desert itself for guidance. Instead of trying to force our way through this landscape using maps and calculations that no longer serve us, I propose that we allow the desert to show us where we need to go. This suggestion struck most of the caravan members as either mystical nonsense or the desperate fantasy of a guide who had completely lost his competence. But something in Jamyang's manner, a quality of presence and groundedness that had replaced his previous anxiety and confusion, gave them pause. One of the older merchants, a man who had traveled with Jamyang on several previous journeys, noticed this transformation and decided to trust it. "What exactly do you mean by listening to the desert?" he asked with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Jamyang's answer would become legendary among desert travelers for generations to come, though few would understand its deeper implications until they found themselves in similar circumstances of complete disorientation. "Every morning," Jamyang explained, "we will sit together in silence for a period before we begin traveling. Instead of maps and of consulting instruments, we will pay attention to the subtle signs that the desert is always offering, the direction of morning breezes, the behavior of birds and animals, the quality of light on different horizons. More importantly, we will listen to our own inner sense of direction, the intuitive knowing that emerges when we stop trying to figure everything out with our thinking minds." This approach seemed completely contrary to everything the merchants understood about practical navigation, yet their circumstances left them with little choice but to trust their guide's new methodology. The next morning, the entire caravan gathered in a circle as the sun rose, sitting in unaccustomed silence while Jamyang guided them through what he called desert meditation, a practice of opening awareness to include not just their immediate concerns about reaching their destination, but the entire living intelligence of the landscape around them. What happened during that first morning of group listening surprised everyone, including Jamyang himself. As the merchants relaxed their urgent need to know exactly where they were going and instead became present to where they actually were, a natural sense of direction began to emerge. Several people independently felt drawn toward the same horizon, not because of any logical reasoning, but because of a subtle feeling of rightness that seemed to arise from their body's own compass-like sensitivity to the land. When they began traveling in the direction that had emerged from their collective listening, the day's journey unfolded with an ease and flow that none of them had experienced during their previous, more conventionally guided travels. They discovered water sources that appeared at exactly the moments when they needed them, found natural shelters during the heat of midday, and covered ground with an efficiency that seemed almost magical compared to the struggle and effort that had characterized their recent travel. As days turned into weeks, and their unconventional navigation method continued to serve them well, something remarkable happened to the entire group. The merchants, who had initially been focused solely on reaching their trading destinations as quickly as possible, began to experience the journey itself as a form of moving meditation. The constant anxiety about being lost gave way to a deep appreciation for the beauty and wisdom of the desert landscape they were traversing. More significantly, each member of the caravan began to develop their own capacity for the kind of intuitive navigation that Jamyang was teaching. They discovered that when they stopped trying to control their direction through mental calculation and instead learned to sense their way forward through present moment awareness, they could contribute valuable insights about water sources, weather patterns, and optimal routes that no single guide, however experienced, could have provided alone. The caravan that had begun as a typical commercial venture, with clearly defined roles of guide and followers, gradually transformed into something more like a spiritual community, with each member contributing their own unique sensitivity to the collective wisdom that guided their travels. Jamyang's role shifted from being the sole repository of navigational knowledge to being a facilitator who helped others discover their own innate capacity for finding direction in uncertainty. When they finally reached their intended destination, arriving not only safely, but with a cargo of insights about desert travel that was as valuable as the silk and precious stones they carried, word of their extraordinary journey spread quickly through the trading communities of Central Asia. Jamyang found himself in demand not just as a guide who could navigate difficult terrain, but as a teacher who could help others discover their own inner compass for finding direction in any kind of challenging circumstances. His teaching method became known as the Way of Sacred Lostness, based on the recognition that our greatest discoveries often occur not when we know where we are going, but when we have the courage to admit that we are completely lost and need to find an entirely different way of orienting ourselves. Students came from across the known world to learn how to navigate not just physical landscapes, but the psychological and spiritual territories that could not be mapped by conventional means. One of his most dedicated students was a young woman named Tara, a merchant's daughter who had always felt lost in her own life, despite having clear social expectations and family plans for her future. When she came to study with Jamyang, she was struggling with the same kind of existential disorientation that he had experienced that night in the desert, though her wilderness was internal rather than external. "Master," she asked during one of their lessons, "how can I find my direction in life when I don't even know what destination I should be seeking? Everyone else seems to know where they're going, but I feel completely lost about what my life should become." Jamyang's response drew directly from his own transformation, from someone who thought he always knew the way to someone who had learned to trust the guidance that emerges from not knowing. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "the feeling of being lost is not a problem to be solved, but a doorway to be entered. Maybe your confusion about your life's direction is actually your psyche's way of preparing you to discover a kind of guidance that cannot be found through conventional planning and goal setting. What if being lost is the first step toward finding a path that is uniquely yours, one that no map could ever show you, because it can only be created through your own authentic movement through the territory of your life?" This perspective transformed Tara's relationship to her uncertainty from something that felt like personal failure into something that felt like spiritual adventure. She began to approach her life choices with the same kind of present moment listening that Jamyang taught for desert navigation, learning to sense her way forward through immediate awareness rather than trying to figure everything out through mental analysis and social comparison. The teaching that emerged from Jamyang's desert awakening became influential far beyond the world of caravan travel, offering a new paradigm for how human beings might navigate not just physical landscapes, but the complex territories of relationship, career, spiritual development, and personal growth. Instead of relying solely on external authorities, predetermined maps, and conventional wisdom, people learn to develop their own sensitivity to the subtle guidance that becomes available when we stop trying to control our direction and instead learn to listen to the deeper intelligence that knows where we need to go. Years later, when Jamyang had become renowned throughout Asia, not just as a master navigator, but as a wisdom teacher whose insights applied to every aspect of human experience, he would often reflect on the gift that his moment of complete lostness had provided. Standing in the same desert where his transformation had begun, now completely at ease with uncertainty and change, he would tell his students, "The desert taught me that there are two kinds of knowing. There is the knowing that comes from accumulating information about where you have been, And there is the knowing that comes from being completely present to where you are right now. The first kind of knowing can take you to familiar destinations. The second kind can take you to places that exist beyond any map, including the place you were always meant to discover but could never have planned to reach. And so, dear friend, as these 7 sacred stories settle into the quiet chambers of your heart, like gentle snow falling on still water, feel how your breath has naturally deepened, how your body has found its way into profound rest, how the endless chatter of worry has dissolved into the vast silence that was always waiting beneath the surface noise of your busy mind. Tonight, you have received not just ancient wisdom, but living medicine, stories that will continue their healing work long after these words fade into memory, planting seeds of peace that will bloom in moments when you need them most. Sleep now with the knowing that you carry within you the same Buddha nature that awakened in Pemba's kitchen, the same boundless freedom that Chen discovered in his movement, the same unbreakable wholeness that Sato-san found in his shattered tea bowl, knowing that your own path to awakening is as unique and perfect as you are.